Hello, everyone. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Art's virtual lunchtime lecture, Authenticity, Fakes, and Misconceptions in Art. My name is Maria Lopez, and I'm the manager of film and lecture programs. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us today. We deeply appreciate your continued support of our virtual programming. Before we begin with the program, I'd like to give everyone an overview for today's lecture. Our lecturer today will present, and then we will have a short Q&A session. Please enter any questions using the Q&A function or the chat box, or since we want to make these lectures a little bit more interactive, you can also share your question out loud with our lecturer by using the raise hand function, and then we will allow you to unmute yourself and ask your question. We would also like to let you know that this lecture will be recorded and made available on the NCMA YouTube page. We will also be sharing the link to the recording with you via email. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the NCMA's Paintings Conservator Perry Hurt. Perry received a BFA in painting and printmaking with a minor in art history from Virginia Commonwealth University in 1983. He continued conservation studies at VCU from 1985 to 1987. After college, Perry formed the Fine Art and Mural Conservation Studio in Fredericksburg, Virginia, which he owned and operated from 1987 until 1998. And included mural conservation projects at the US Capitol Building and the Library of Congress. In 1998, Perry became the NCMA Conservator for Regional Conservation Services, an NCMA Foundation position, which offered art conservation to institutions throughout the state. In 2008, Perry's museum position changed to Conservator, NCMA state position, with his responsibility switching to the care of the museum's permanent collection, including research and conservation treatment of paintings, routine maintenance and remedial treatment of the collection, and conservation oversight of all NCMA collection loans. Perry also contributes presentations, tours, and blogs for the museum. Since 2001, Perry has conducted research on the history of artist paint. This work has resulted in extensive museum programming, including the Focus exhibition, Revolution in Paint, which Perry curated in 2006. In 2010, Perry started an in-depth study and conservation treatment project for the NCMA's early British portraits. The paintings and research were showcased in the 2016 exhibition, History and Mystery, Discoveries in the NCMA British Collection, which also marked the first time in 40 years that the NCMA had organized an exhibition focused on British art from its collection. Welcome, Perry.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be with everybody here today. I'm really glad that you've joined us. I hope you're having a great day. Hopefully you'll find my presentation interesting, and let's get it up on the screen here. Here we go. And we have to hit a couple of buttons here, slideshow. There we go. Can we see that, Maria? Are we good?
We're good.
Okay, very good. Well, actually, that's the wrong slide. So we're not good. Let me let me end the show and go back from beginning. And let's try that again. Here we go. One more time. There we go. Okay. So I packed a lot into the, are we good?
Good.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Maria. I packed a lot into today's presentation. Hopefully it's not too much. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end regardless, but I'm going to jump right into the middle of this and introduce you to the Fiji Mermaid. So my rhetorical question to you at the beginning of the talk here is this real? Is it authentic? Is it a fake or a forgery? And I will tell you right at the beginning here that when I first saw Fiji Mermaid, I was very convinced. I'll just let you chew on that for just a minute while we talk about the Fiji Mermaid. The example that I have on the screen here at the lower left is in the collection of Harvard University, a relatively respectable institution. So we can at least take it on good faith that this object actually exists, whether it's authentic or not. If we go back into the history of the Fiji Mermaid, the first Fiji Mermaid came into the western part of the world in the early 1800s. Apparently, it was purchased by sailors in Japan. It was made by Japanese fishermen. Later in the century, quite a few of these came out, and it appears that the Japanese fishermen made these objects possibly as a joke, but also there's some evidence that it was used in in their cultural ceremonies, possibly religious significance, that sort of thing. So at least at that point, we can't really say it's a fake or a forgery. But by the time it came to the Western world, it was purchased by an English sea captain who promptly set it up in local establishments like pubs and charged people to see it. And along the way, he also tried to get various different scientists and naturalists to authenticate it, many of which did not, some did. So it was kind of mixed results there. Relatively quickly, by about 1840 or so, he sold that first Fiji Mermaid to P.T. Barnum of circus fame. P.T. Barnum was a great show person. Of course, that's why his circuses were so successful. And so he put the mermaid on view, and it was extremely successful, got a lot of money pouring in because of this. And he was really good about the way he promoted it because he built a lot of stories around it, how it had been acquired, that sort of thing, which weren't altogether truthful at times. You can see from the ad up here at the top that most of the time it was displayed with other things, other unusual things that were unusual, especially at the beginning of the 19th century. So for instance, Egyptian mummies, Peruvian mummies, but also the duck-billed platypus, which is interesting because this is a very mixed up animal on first view. It looks like a cross between a bird and a beast, as this article refers to, or this ad refers to. And so, in that context, you start wondering, well, is this mermaid real or not? And that's very much the context that I first experienced it in. When I first saw it, it was sandwiched between two oddities of nature, which were very well documented. So it gave some credence to the mermaid being authentic. Now, I will add that at the time I first saw it, I was 9 years old, and I had not really been cued into fakes and forgeries, the reality of them, and I still trusted pretty much whatever an adult told me at the time. But I've learned a few things since then, so I'm gonna talk about that today. So here's a graph that I put together, and it really kind of illustrates what my talk is going to be about today. So at the top here, we have authentic or autograph, it's often called. This is something that's made by the hand of the artist. It's as true as it gets. And then at the other extreme, we have fakes and forgeries, something that absolutely has nothing to do with the artist it pretends to be. And then in between, you have this huge gray area. Now, when I put this chart together, I was really thinking about old master paintings. So some of the terms I'm using here are a little bit more specific to old master paintings, but they really apply to just about any artwork that we're talking about. So if we start at authentic or autograph, once again, that is as real as it gets by the hand of the artist. Slightly below that, you have workshop of the artist. Almost any artist, especially during the old master period, that was successful very quickly grew a studio around him with many helpers, many very accomplished painters to create the artworks that he was commissioned to create. And so many times these artworks come out of the workshop with the original artist's signature. Just below that, you have circle of the artist. That might be people, an artist down the block who sees how successful that first artist is being. And so he copies the technique, the look of that artist. So it's not an outright forgery, but at the same time, he's kind of hitching his wagon to the fame and fortune of the first artist. Then you have school of the artist. That's very similar, but it can cross over time. So 100 years later, an artist can look at the technique and the style of this earlier artist and appreciate it and model their own work after that. So that's school of the artist. Then you have a copy. Copies are extremely numerous. Copies that were made in good faith. That's how you learned as an artist, is going and copying the artwork of someone who you really appreciate. And these are quite common. Then you also have copies that are reproductions. And you can see we're kind of switching to the other side of the spectrum now. A copy is certainly not a fake or a forgery, but it's where an artist has been paid to go make a copy of something, and say in a museum, that sort of thing. Then you have hopeful attribution. That is, someone owns an artwork. They're not quite sure who it's by, but they have some confidence that they can make a good decision, and they put a name on the painting. It may or may not be true. Then you have misattribution. That is, this hopeful attribution, maybe it was pretty misguided and it's actually the wrong attribution, but it may take some time to figure that out. Then we really start getting into the deceptive area of fakes and forgeries. We have a pastiche, that is where an object has been kind of cobbled together, and some parts of it might be original and some parts not. And then as we move down, deliberate deceptive attributions, putting the wrong name knowingly on an artwork or making an artwork that is literally a fake or a forgery. So the rest of my talk today is going to be pretty much following this graph. We'll start with authentic and autograph and move down into fakes and forgeries. So the very first thing I'm going to show you is a painting from the North Carolina Museum of Art, and it's by Peter Aertsen, painted around 1551. This is a fantastic painting. It's one of my top 10. I'm not certain about anybody else, but I love this painting. It is fantastic. The detail is really extraordinary. So the interesting thing is that there are at least 4 extant paintings that are nearly identical to our painting. I'm sorry, I'm including our painting in that 4. And so the question among scholars is, which one came first? Well, you know, logically speaking, there has to be a first one, the first painting that the artist created. And then in the old master context, once again, if it was a popular painting and the artist wanted to make more money, more commissions would come in for a copy of that painting. So he would reproduce it. And most of the time, that reproduction process would go to his studio hands, who would reproduce the original painting very faithfully. And the master of the studio may not touch that copy at all. So from a art historical importance and also monetary importance, we want to know which one came first. As I said, all 4 of these paintings, one's in Uppsala, one's in, sorry, I just forgot the name of the institution. These other three are in Europe. They're indistinguishable in almost every respect. It's very, very hard, and everybody has a different opinion about which ones could be the original one. But we can apply some technology here, and I have to say, this kind of looks like it's in favor of our painting here at the North Carolina Museum of Art. So here's a detail that was taken in the infrared. We use infrared night vision to examine artworks, and in this case, you can see this detail is from the upper right in our painting, these 2 cuts of meat that are hanging here. And if you look very closely in the lighter areas near the center of the image, you can see the drawing, the cross-hatching, these dark marks that go across the composition. What we're seeing here is actually we're looking through the paint. Infrared allows us to look through the paint and see the drawing underneath. And in this case, we have an underdrawing that was necessary to be applied before the paint was applied. As far as we know, the other versions of this painting have no detectable underdrawing. So right there, we have a suggestion that ours is the first one. Secondly, you see quite a few changes, artist changes in our painting. That is, during the process of creating the painting, the artist changed his mind and he made various different changes to arrive at the result that he wanted. Almost invariably, copies that are made after the original do not have these changes. So we have several things going in our favor that suggest that ours is what we would call the prime version. Now we're jumping a little bit, and I'm just presenting the fact that over time, artworks change. It's inevitable. Everything's from the moment the artist pulls back their hands, the artwork starts to change. It's just a matter of how fast it changes. So in the middle of your screen here, you have a painting that I treated several years ago. This painting is about 200 years old. And on the right side of the image, you see the painting as I first saw it. That is very dirty, very discolored, old restorations which have gone bad, all that sort of thing. The left hand of the painting is during the cleaning process where I've cleaned and varnished that side of the painting. And that side is starting to appear more like the painting would have originally looked. The example is here simply to show how much a painting can change over time. And this is very important when we start talking about forgeries, because the forgers will need to simulate this in some way, shape, or form. So here's another example along the same lines. This is a painting that I treated. Painting's about 400 years old. And on the left, you see it before treatment, and on the right, you see it after treatment. So very similar to the previous example, you see that cleaning it made a huge difference. It looks much brighter, much more clear, the colors are better, all sorts of other things. What you don't see is the actual condition of the painting. So here it is. the actual condition of the painting. And you can see it is very, very different. There's a lot going on here. And having experienced this painting, I can tell you that it actually went through a serious trauma, maybe a fire, whatever else. But the other thing it shows us is that this is actually only a fraction of a larger painter. You may have noticed in the right-hand image, on the left edge of the right-hand image, there's actually another collar there, the backside of another collar, and you can see the shoulder of a figure. So what we have here is just a fragment of a much larger painting that survived a traumatic event and then was restored to appear to be a finished portrait. And so this gives you some insight into the things that an artwork can go through in their lifetime that can really both add to the story, what we expect an artwork to go through if it's authentic, but it can also be used to muddy the waters to make a forgery look that much more real to us. Very quickly, conservation uses all sorts of analytical processes to understand an artwork. These are 3 examples. In the top center, we have an X-ray of a painting, which shows all the materials of the painting, right down to the stretcher behind the stretch canvas painting and the taxel on the top. On the right, we have, once again, an infrared image, just like we saw a moment ago with the meat stall. And then at the bottom, you have a cross section. That is a sample of paint that's taken, where you can see the layering, just like cutting through a cake. You can see the layering of the paint that goes on the surface of the painting. And in all these cases, it gives us insight into the construction of the artwork. The construction of an artwork has changed over time. It was done differently at different times. So this can inform us of the age of the artwork, but it can also inform us if the apparent age of the painting is really not constructed in the way that you would expect for that. So we'll see more examples of this in just a moment. Here's one example of how infrared helped us once again. This is a very nice painting of a woman that came to me for treatment. And it on the surface, at least, it looks like an 18th century portrait of a woman. Part of the analytical process we did was an infrared image. You see that on the right. It's kind of hard to see here. So we're going to look at a couple of details. And here's the detail of the face. So if you compare these 2 things, and once again, infrared in some cases is looking through the top layers of paint to what's underneath. So in looking at these 2 faces and comparing them, you see some differences. And I think without really drawing attention to individual little differences, just in general, the infrared image on the right, the black and white image, this looks like a real person. It looks like somebody that you would know, that you could run into on the street. While the image on the left of the face, it's very generic. It's almost too pretty, too even, too symmetrical. And once again, if you look back to the infrared image, black and white, this woman has some age. She's showing some of her faults, so to speak. And those faults have been erased in the colored image that we see on the surface here. So let's look at one more detail, and this is the detail of the shoulder to the right, and particularly the brooch on the shoulder. And you can see that in the colored image, the surface image, you can see that brooch very solidly. If you look to the infrared image, you may be able to see the shadow of a second brooch just to the lower left of the original one, or the one that we can see without infrared. So once again, this tells me, one, this could be an artist change, but knowing more about this painting, it's very clear that this painting had a very serious problem, had a very serious condition problem, and up to 80% of the surface was repainted in a restoration. So this has dramatically changed this object. It's very much in the gray area. We're really not seeing the authentic painting anymore. We're really just seeing a shadow, a suggestion of the original painting, and which is probably 100 years older than the image that we are actually seeing on the surface. So while this isn't a fake or a forgery, it's clearly not what the artist intended to look like. Another thing that we do with our analytical equipment is to identify pigments. And if you know the history, a little bit about the history of pigments, it has changed over time rather dramatically. So if we go back to prehistoric cave paintings, there are relatively few pigments that were available to early human beings to create paint and to make a painting. As we come forward in time, technology builds. So in the ancient Egyptian times, we had about 12 pigments, including the first man-made pigment. Medieval times, more technology is applied and we have more pigments. By the Renaissance, we have 30, 40 pigments that could commonly be used, say, in an oil painting, something like that. And then by the 19th century, we have the Industrial Revolution, which greatly multiplies the number of pigments that are available to the artist. 20th century, even more so. And so where this comes into play is that if we are looking at an object, say we're looking at an object that purports to be an ancient Egyptian artwork, and it has paint on the surface, we can analyze that paint. And if we find 19th century pigments on the surface of that artwork, we really have to question, is this an authentic artwork or not? So here's an example of an authentic artwork in our collection, a painting by Paul van Sommer. In analyzing this painting, we took a little sample from the fan at the lower right corner of the painting. And this is one example of an analysis that we conduct, or actually had sent out for this. It's called Raman spectroscopy. And it gives you a readout of all these little peaks and valleys. The blue that you see here is the actual readout for the sample. And then we compare that with known samples, which was the red line just below. And in this case, it's a perfect match for the pigment called smalt blue. Now, smalt's interesting. It's a very bright blue pigment. It's a beautiful pigment, but it was pretty specifically used in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. It fell out of favor because better blues came along. So for a painting that's signed 1619, and we're pretty confident that that date is correct, smalt blue is exactly the pigment that we would expect to find there. Now, going a step back, when I was showing you this slide, did you see anything peculiar about this slide? Is there anything that jumps out to you that's a little off? I'll give you a second to think about it. The thing I'm pointing out to you is that that woman down in the lower left, I think most of you would know this as the Mona Lisa, correct? Well, that's not the Mona Lisa that you think it is. The Mona Lisa that you think it is the Louvre version that's on the screen now. The version that was on the screen previously in the lower left there, that's the Prado version of the Mona Lisa. And in fact, there are many, many Mona Lisas floating around out there. Here are just a few examples. And the Louvre version is at the upper right. Now, what we call the provenance of an artwork, where it's been since the artist created it, can be very important in establishing if something is authentic or in that gray area or fake or forgery. The Louvre Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci is almost certainly real and authentic because it's been very well documented since the day Leonardo made it, and it was sold to the French government and it stayed in the Louvre ever since. But there are many, many other copies floating around there. All these copies are up to debate as to how authentic they are. The Isleworth Mona Lisa right next to it, it's one of the most interesting. Many, many scholars see Leonardo da Vinci's hand in this painting, particularly in the figure. But most of them will tell you that the background has nothing to do with Leonardo da Vinci. This might be an example where Leonardo may have actually painted the figure, not finished the painting, and then someone had come along later, put in this background, and the painting started floating around. The Hecking Mona Lisa that you see at the top left is an example where almost everybody agrees this could not possibly have been painted by by Leonardo da Vinci, and in fact was painted at least 100 years later. But the owner of this painting several decades ago argued very vehemently that no, this was actually the real Mona Lisa. So the waters get very muddy very quickly. As you can see at the lower right, we actually have nude Mona Lisas floating around out there. And then at the lower left, we have the Prado version. Now, many of these versions, including the Prado version, the modern scholarship is that these were painted by students of Leonardo da Vinci, or people in his studio created these, possibly as copies to sell, commissions for another copy of this painting. But the Prado version in particular is really interesting because up until just a few decades ago, it looked like the image on the left, that is the before image. It had been heavily overpainted and restored in the past. And when it was cleaned about 20 years ago, the image that we see in the after image is what popped out. And it was at this point that people realized, oh, this really could be a Mona Lisa. So they started studying it very closely. And most scholars now agree that this was painted by a student of Leonardo, possibly at the exact same time that Leonardo was painting the Virgin in the Louvre. And this is very interesting because you might notice the coloration is different. The Louvre Mona Lisa, which we all agree is authentic, is heavily covered by varnish, discolored by varnish. So in many ways, we jokingly say, you've never seen the Mona Lisa because you're looking through all this varnish. The Prado version has been cleaned very well, has exactly the same pigments, exactly the same techniques in many cases. So in some way, it almost represents the real Mona Lisa better than the original does. And there is also the two Mona Lisa theory. Now, what the story is here is that there's some various different information that suggests that Leonardo da Vinci painted two versions of the Mona Lisa. One he may not have finished. The Isleworth example is one that jumps to mind, where this could be the second version by by Da Vinci. One of the parts of information that we have that suggests that the existing Louvre Mona Lisa is not the only Mona Lisa by Da Vinci is this drawing by Raphael. The artist Raphael visited Da Vinci, saw the Mona Lisa during the process of being created, and he created his own drawing. Now, we don't know if he drew it standing there looking at Da Vinci's painting or if he drew it later, but you can see that there are some significant differences between the Louvre Mona Lisa and Raphael's drawing. You see these columns very prominently displayed on the side. You see her dress, the neckline is very different. There are various other things, the background's very different, things like that. So in some people's mind, this suggests that Raphael was actually looking at a different painting, not the Louvre example that we know today. The Walters Art Museum copy that we see on the far right is one of these examples that suggests that whoever made this copy for the Walters Art Museum was actually looking at the second Da Vinci version. So once again, this is all very interesting, but just muddies the waters. Here's another example of misidentification. These are two groups of English portraits that are in the North Carolina Museum of Art. They're roughly about 400 years old. You see the Paul Van Sommer paintings at the bottom. We saw the portrait of the woman a little earlier. Those two paintings we know very well. They are provenance. Their story is very clear. We know exactly who these people are. We know Paul Van Sommer painted these paintings. But these 7 paintings above it are called the Scott Collection, and they were painted about the same time. And they also came down through the family, very solid provenance for the most part. But surprisingly, the names of the sitters in these paintings and also the attribution for the artist is almost invariably wrong. Over time, things change. It's as simple as that. These paintings, even though they stayed in the family, have been through multiple hands, and every time they've changed generations, someone has decided that they wanted to add some more information. And as I often tell people, in the old world, before modern photography, you had a portrait made. Within a couple of generations, there's no one alive who knew this person. So it's very easy to misidentify somebody. And so in the case of these 7 Scott paintings, 5 of them we know have the wrong attribution or the wrong identification for the sitter. So let's jump to another attribution issue. These are 4 paintings that are in the North Carolina Museum of Art. When our collection opened to the public some 60, 70 years ago, our first director, Willem Valentiner, was one of the foremost Rembrandt scholars in the world. And of course, being the director of our museum and overseeing the accumulation of that early collection, he wanted Rembrandts in the museum. So these 4 paintings came into the collection. Unfortunately, none of them are considered Rembrandts any longer. A lot of scholarship has gone around. Back in the 60s and 70s, there was the Rembrandt, I just forgot the name of it, the Rembrandt Commission, I believe it was. And these were scholars mostly from the Netherlands who realized there were just too many Rembrandts in the world. There too many paintings had been attributed to Rembrandt. And so they set about debunking a lot of these attributions. The top 2, the far top right and the middle one, have been reattributed to Jan Levens. Jan Levens, interestingly, was the same age as Rembrandt. They studied together in various different studios, and they were actually roommates for a long time, and they had a very similar style for a very long time. So it's kind of understandable that these Jan Levens paintings would be reattributed to Rembrandt. Why would they be reattributed? Well, Rembrandt became famous in the 19th century, and the values skyrocketed on his paintings. So anything that looked like a Rembrandt, people wanted to attribute to Rembrandt so they could make money on the sale of them. The one at the lower right is by Govert Flinck, has been reattributed to Govert Flinck, which is among the many students and employees that Rembrandt had in the studio. He was a very successful painter in his lifetime. He had so many commissions that he had to hire very skilled artists to paint in his style to create these, to fulfill these commissions so he could make money. And one of the practices that is well documented is that a commission would come in, it wasn't quite important enough, so he wouldn't even touch it. One of his talented studio people would create this portrait, and if he liked it, if he thought it was up to good enough quality, Rembrandt would sign the painting himself. And that's exactly the example we appear to have at the top left. This is a very nice portrait. We are very glad to have it, but almost all the experts say it's just not quite good enough to be by the hand of Rembrandt himself. But curiously, up near the top, you have a lovely Rembrandt signature, and almost no one debates that this is an original Rembrandt signature. Once again, is this the real thing? Is it authentic Rembrandt, or is it a forgery? Well, it's certainly not a forgery, but it falls a little bit into that gray zone. Here's another example of a painting that I treated at one time. You can see what it looked like on the left when I first saw it. And I put a little vignette of the earlier portrait that I worked on. And you can see some similarities in how they look after they aged and various things have changed. But then the process of cleaning it and varnishing it, it didn't lighten up. It didn't clean up like the other one. And the reason for that is this is a painting, a copy of an older painting. And then paint was actually applied over the top to mimic the way an old varnish looks. So this is clearly a newer painting that is a copy of an old painting. So is it a fake or a forgery? We don't know that because it's actually the context, how was this painting presented? Was it presented as a copy, as a known copy? That's not a forgery. But if it was presented as the actual old painting that it might look to be, well, then of course that's a fake or forgery. Here are a couple of other examples that are very similar. Both of these sculptures are in our collection here at the museum. The bone box on the left here is a beautiful example of 2nd century CE. And for the most part, it is in fantastic shape, although it's definitely shown its age. The stone is almost melted in certain areas just from erosion and that sort of thing. But on this side of the box, it's carved on all four sides, and all four sides look a bit different. On the ends there, we have some large figures, and those heads are rather melted. You really can't see the features in the face. But on this side of the box that you're seeing, the features are quite clear. But also you will notice that the heads are slightly too small for the figure. So in this case, a couple of centuries ago, probably, a very good sculptor went back in and recarved the heads to make this object more pretty, so to speak, and more sellable. So in this case, it's not exactly a restoration or a forgery, but it's definitely kind of cheating a little bit. The Bacchus sculpture, on the other hand, on the right-hand side here, is a very long and involved story, which I really can't go into today, but I will tell you that the torso is original Roman from the 2nd century. The legs and all the other parts that have been attached to it are actually only about 500 years old that were attached during the Renaissance. Is this a fake or a forgery? Well, not exactly, because 500 years ago, when these fragments of sculpture were coming out of the ground in the Mediterranean world, the people who were buying them, who wanted to acquire them, they really weren't interested in fragments. They wanted to see a complete sculpture. So it's very kind of on the up and up, very wide open, that these fragments would be added to. Sculptors of the day, Michelangelo, Bernini, people like that were employed to carve the legs and arms and other pieces that were necessary to complete a sculpture. That's just what the paying public wanted to have. So in that case, it's not a fake or a forgery. It's very much understood. The problem is that as we move into our present time, all of that is forgotten. So oftentimes when we walk into a gallery in a museum, we see a complete sculpture when in fact it's very piecemeal, just like I'm describing. This is an interesting painting that came up a few years ago. It was treated here in the museum. And interestingly, this is after the treatment. So I really can't, I wish I had a previous picture. But the interesting thing is that we have this lovely little vignette of the woman and the child. And before the painting was cleaned, the child's hair had a wreath of flowers in it. And it appeared that the older woman was arranging the flowers in her hair. The reality is that those flowers were added very recently. They are not original to the painting. So why are they there? Well, it made the painting more sellable because what the woman is actually doing is she's combing through this little girl's hair for lice, picking lice out of the little girl's hair, which isn't the most pleasant subject. So what do? You paint some flowers over the top of it and it makes the painting much more sellable. Here's an example that I ran across. It's a very nice view of a covered bridge. But as I was starting to examine it, I saw some unusual things. So this is an ultraviolet image, and you will notice in the lower center there, all this dark area. Well, that's kind of a red flag to me that something's been changed there. So then I looked at it in infrared, and you'll see kind of a vague light form down in that same area that kind of looks like the Loch Ness Monster, but not quite. And then if we look at a little bit more detail, you'll start to understand what that is. And then once I cleaned the painting, you will see that what it actually is are three young men swimming in the creek here. Well, apparently, just very much like the last painting, someone decided that that was a little unsavory or hurt the value of the painting. And so they simply painted those figures out. The original artist did not do that. This is the original artist painting. But someone much later who was trying to sell the painting probably decided that they could get more money for the painting without the skinny dippers there. So here's an attribution story, and this is a little bit long-winded, so I'm going to try to make it short. When you're looking at, when we look at paintings, a lot of times the judgment as to whether it's authentic or not is purely on what we see on the surface. Oftentimes we call in art historians, things like that. We call this connoisseurship, where they're comparing things between known paintings and unknown paintings and trying to decide if the artist actually painted this new painting. So in these two paintings, there are some differences, but there's some real similarities. If you look at the way the background and the trees are painted, the coloration, they're extremely similar. So you could make the jump in logic that the two paintings are by the same person. So if we add a little bit more information, you will see that the top left painting is by Monet, and it happens to be in the North Carolina Museum of Art, while and was painted a little over 100 years ago, while the painting at the lower right happens to include some Star Wars stormtroopers. Well, it's highly unlikely that Monet knew anything about Star Wars or stormtroopers. So we can be pretty clear that this painting at the lower right is not by Monet, and in fact, it's by Thomas Kincaid and some friends who were having fun with his image. But this brings up a quick story. I was presented with a painting years ago. Painting was brought to the museum, and the person wanted me to have an opinion about it. So it was a very nice landscape, and it had this big crude Monet signature in the lower right corner. And I was quite confident it was not a Monet. And I told the person that it was nice older materials. It's a pleasant painting, but it was in no way, shape, or form a Monet. A couple of years went by, and I got a call in the middle of the day from an irate French person, authority, who was upset with me because I had authenticated a Monet painting that clearly was not a Monet painting. So the story was, when I first accepted that painting into the museum, just for the hour or two that it took to have this meeting with the owner, there was paperwork when he came in the door just to show that it was his property. So it had North Carolina Museum of Art at the top, property pass, and then all down the center it had owner, artist, all that information. And in there it said attribution, and Monet was put in there because that's what the owner said. Well, the owner turned around several years later and used that paperwork to suggest that I and the North Carolina Museum of Art had actually attributed his painting to Monet, and he had put it up for auction. So our lawyers got involved, and the artwork was promptly pulled from that auction. So I'm going to jump. These are a couple of fakes that came into the collection. Both of these were debunked by looking very closely at the materials, analyzing the materials, and we were able to show that these were in fact fakes. And here are some of our famous fakers. Probably the most famous for the 20th century is Han van Meegeren, and he's famous really because of his connection to World War II and the Nazis in particular. His story is similar to a lot of the fakers that we see, these two other gentlemen on the screen as well. He was a very skilled artist. He made a lot of artwork of his own, but somewhere along the line, he found out that making forgeries made a lot more money. And so he studied very vigorously how to make very good forgeries, and he oftentimes would make Vermeer forgeries. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, one of his paintings made it into the collection of a famous Nazi. And after the war, Van Meegeren was implicated in selling cultural artifacts to the Nazis, which was a death sentence, I believe, or at least a very stringent sentence. And in his defense, he said, I forged these paintings. I made these paintings myself. And so no one believed him. So he actually had to do it in his cell. They brought him the materials and he reproduced the paintings very faithfully. And he was exonerated from collusion, but he was convicted for forgery at the same time. The other two paintings we see here are other fakers are just recently John Myatt, Englishman, who created over 200 forgeries. He was caught because he got very upset with his accomplice, who was a gallery owner. His accomplice was taking too much money out of the sales and not enough of it was coming to John. So he got upset and went to the police and helped inform the whole process. And that's how that came to light. Probably one of the most extraordinary fakers is Wolfgang Beltracchi, who we see at the lower right here. And he, by his own estimation, has made over 1,000 forgeries. And one of those he sold for 7 million, although I have to say some further research I did, it might have been only for $2 million. But once again, both of these men, John and Wolfgang, both sold through auction houses, known Christie's, Sotheby's, that sort of thing. And they sold artworks that people felt were very confident that they were the real thing, and they were selling them for a great deal of money. Both Van Meegeren and Beltracchi, ultimate downfall was analysis of artworks. Conservators, specialists in this, analyzed their paintings and found that the materials were 20th century materials. They were not the pigments and whatnot that would have been used in previous centuries. So that's how they were found out. I think at this point, this is a very good place to stop, and I will invite Maria to come back on the screen, and we will take any questions that you might have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Okay, so I do want to ask the audience, all of you joining us today, to continue sharing your messages, your questions, comments in the chat. We did receive a couple of questions. The first one is from Chuck, who was asking, have they done any DNA testing on the Fiji?
Good question. I'm not familiar enough with the research on the Fiji Mermaid. Certainly they could do DNA. It's interesting when you look at the history. There's quite a bit of history online, which I would welcome you to look up. And it always kind of vacillates back and forth about, did the various owners along the time really believe that what they had was real or not? In P.T. Barnum's case, I'm pretty certain he knew exactly that it was not the real thing. But he was presenting it as such just so he could make some money. And what I've been told, I haven't been able to examine one of these myself, is that in some cases they are very well made. The stitching a piece of a fish to a piece of a monkey or a primate, it was done very well, and so it could almost be construed to be the real thing. But in many cases, when you look at them in real life up close, they are not that well made. So I don't think it's fooled very many people, to tell you the truth. And the other thing I forgot to say about analysis in general, like DNA analysis, it's expensive. It's not something you're going to do on a lark. You have to be really interested in the artwork and have the resources to pursue analytical tests.
Okay, thank you, Perry. We also got a question from Diane Beckman. Do we know why the Louvre hasn't removed the varnish from the Mona Lisa?
I won't put the words in the Louvre's mouth, but I can tell you my perspective as a conservator. I think you can arguably say the Mona Lisa is the most well-known and maybe the most important painting in the world, artwork in the world. And no one wants to be responsible for damaging it in any way, shape, or form. When we, as a conservator, when you remove varnish from a painting, there's some risk involved. You can affect the original painting. And so that's a lot of responsibility. So when you're talking about the most valuable, the most important painting in the world, no one wants to take that risk. And that's essentially the way the Louvre has gone in their protection of the painting. They don't want to take any risks with it. So they have done surface treatments to the painting to reduce some of the varnish. And actually the image that I show you of the Louvre Mona Lisa has been digitally enhanced to reduce some of the discoloration that is there because of the old varnish.
So we also got a question, let's see, from Jonathan, and it's quite a long one, but it's interesting. Does it matter who hits the game-winning home run? An example, when evaluating the worth of a painting, which matters more, the artist who painted it or the quality of the painting? Are we paying for the artist's name or for the painting, regardless of who painted it?
That is the age-old question. It's you know, it really gets into ideas about art and not so much the art itself. I would absolutely agree that the value, the monetary value of a painting is driven much more by the artist, by the known qualities of an artist. Having been in the art world so long, I know so many talented artists that cannot make a living as an artist. They make fantastic artworks, but they're not a known name. They're not a known quantity. They don't have an auction record that helps people put a price on their artwork. So when we talk about a Monet or a Rembrandt or any number of well-known artists, they are forged because they have a market value just because of their name. That's why these forgers can be so successful. So, you know, art is in the eye of the beholder. I'll always say that. So judging whether we are paying for the quality of an artwork or for the name, I will almost always come down on the side that we're paying for a name in so many cases.
Okay, and we also got a question from, let's see, Richard. Does the NCMA provide authentication services? And if so, what is the typical cost?
We do not offer those kind of services in any way, shape, or form. The one thing I could have said and should have said from the very beginning is that to truly authenticate an artwork is extraordinarily difficult. We would use any number of battery of analytical tests and any number of specialists to look at an artwork to divine whether it's authentic or not. We look at the provenance. There's a great deal of resources that would need to go to authenticating an artwork. It is extremely difficult. It's much easier to say what an artwork is not. When we do the analytical tests, when we do the eye test, so to speak, with connoisseurship, we oftentimes find red flags that very quickly show that an artwork is not what it purports to be. That's a much easier thing to accomplish. But truly authenticating an artwork, that is a hard thing to do. And it's also, in a legal sense, a risky thing to do. So it's something that we avoid here at the North Carolina Museum of Art, except of course for our own collection. That's within our power, within our capability to try to accurately attribute our artworks.
We also got a question from Camille Turner. What is the motivation to become a forger besides money?
That's an interesting question. I think money probably is the number one motivator, but if you look back at the stories of Van Meegeren and some of the other forgers, there's kind of a consistent theme where they're a very skilled artist, but they can't make a living and they're poor. And then they find out, oh, I can fake something and make money. So there's a certain amount of resentment built into it. It's almost like they're justifying what they're doing because the art world ignored their original work. So they're going to pull the wool over people's eyes by creating forgeries. And in Van Meegeren's case, I mean, he set out very, very clearly to show I can paint just like the old masters. I'm going to show you how well I can do it.
And we also got a question from AH, and their question is, with advances in technology, is it even possible to pass a master off as an original?
That's a good question. From my standpoint, if you had unlimited resources to analyze an artwork, to bring in all the consultants that you possibly could, I think it is almost impossible to pass off a forgery, especially if you're talking about an old master artwork, something that is old to begin with. On the other hand, there's all sorts of things, contemporary art. Contemporary art, you don't have the luxury of being able to say, oh, that technology, that pigment wasn't available at that time like we do for an old master. With contemporary art, it's much easier to forge things. Thinking about an artist like Banksy, who's current artist who is in the UK. I don't think anybody actually knows who this artist is. And the artworks frequently crop up in very public areas. Who's to say that those aren't forgeries? It's very hard to, especially because Banksy chooses to be anonymous and to create their artwork the way they do. How do you authenticate that? It's very difficult.
We also got an interesting question from Karen. How does the museum authenticate a piece prior to purchase?
Well, once again, I'll split some hairs. To say we authenticate it isn't quite accurate, because we really cannot put the time and resources into authenticating something without a shadow of a doubt before we acquire things. But we definitely go through our paces before we acquire an artwork. One, the curators who identify artworks to be acquired are specialists in their field. They know their artworks very well. So they will put the energy into making sure that they're picking something that they can trust from a source that they can trust, that sort of thing. But we also do go and physically look at the artworks ourselves. That is, in many cases, a conservator in our department will be sent to examine the artwork to make sure as best as possible that it is what it purports to be. And if we can't physically be there, we will contract a local specialist, a local conservator to wherever the artwork is to go and look at it, not only to make sure that it is what it's supposed to be, but also just the condition of it. Because as we've seen before, time has its effect on artwork. We want to make sure that we are handling it correctly, shipping it correctly. We're not going to damage it in the way that we're moving it around. So we need this kind of insight before we purchase something.
And we got two similar questions related to this as well. And that is, has anyone tried to donate a forged item or piece to the museum? And the other question was, has anybody or has NCMA discovered that any of the collection, any item in our collection was not authenticated authentic? And
Sure.
if so, how was it handled?
Sure. Well, I glossed over it pretty quickly there, but the two early, I believe they're both Roman or Greek ceramics, they were judged to be fakes, forgeries, and they were in our collection. They had been for decades, and they were debunked by analysis. The materials proved not to be correct. And we could actually, one of those ceramics, we could actually age the ceramic itself. I'm sorry, gauge the age of the ceramic, and it was nowhere near as old as it was supposed to be. So they were clearly forgeries. To go back through the context of it, I guess you could make the argument that someone was just trying to make an object as close as they could to the original, and they added the aging qualities and all that kind of thing. But the fact that it came into the collection, it was presented as an authentic object. And so once we could confirm that it was not an authentic object, it was not of the age it purported to be, then it clearly was a forgery. And in both of those cases, I believe they were both deaccessioned. They're no longer in the collection. And that's generally what we would do with forgeries. Although saying that, there is definitely a modern movement, a modern interest in forgery. So there are a lot of known forgeries that stay in collections. One, it's just an interesting story and a study case that you can keep on hand to be able to educate people. But in the case of some of the modern forgers I just showed you, they have become famous in their own right, and their artwork, known as forgeries, stay in collections because people just have an interest in them. There have been exhibitions of strictly forged artwork in the last decade or so, just because there is so much interest in them. Have there been objects that have been donated to the museum that were forgeries? Yes, absolutely. That's how we get almost everything in our collection. Not everything. A large percentage of our collection is donated to us. But I would think, I don't know of any case where we found out that the owner actually knew it was a forgery. In most cases, they're not aware of it. They're just strictly donating what they think is something that's real to us, and we find out later.
Okay, we have another great question about from Jonathan. Is there a case where reproduction of a work of art surpassed in quality the original?
I'm sure it's happened. I'm not aware of that myself. One of the things, this gets into an area that I like to talk about a lot, and it may not answer your question, but I think it bears saying. And that is that one of the aspects of every original artwork that is totally unintended, but it cannot be avoided, is that the artwork is a product of the day and time and place that was made. It's a cultural object. It's a time capsule from the day it was made. It encapsulates the available technologies, it encapsulates the available materials, and it encapsulates the knowledge of the person that made it. So in that respect, anytime a forgery is made of that object, by definition, it doesn't fit that bill. It is at least outwardly a copy of that object, but it's not made at the same time and place. It's made with different technology, different materials, all those sorts of things. So just by definition, it can't exceed the original as being what all original artwork is. That is the time capsule of the time it was made.
All right, we have another one. Let's see, from Mary Beth. How many paintings does the NCMA cleaner conserve each year?
Relatively few. To do a full treatment like the ones that I showed you there, that can take a year, 2 years or more. And because of the many other things that we do, we're essentially, our job as a department in the museum is to preserve things, make them last as long as possible. So a full restoration, like working on a painting or another artwork, that's just a small percentage of what we're actually doing. And so as a result, those kind of treatments, they're very involved, they take a lot of time. So we can only do a few of them at a time. So a painting like that, maybe one a year, something like that for me. And we have 4 or 5 people in the department. So we're only going through 3, 4, 5 major treatments like that. We're probably going through 20 or 30 minor treatments where it's something that takes much less work just to keep an object in good shape, that sort of thing.
So this one might be, yeah, this one just says, do you have any thoughts on, oh, give me 1 second, I lost the question, about the Da Vinci Salvator Mundi?
I do, but it's not a very well-informed opinion. I think that's an example of how the art market goes crazy for a name. We can go back to the question that was raised earlier. Quality-wise, it could be a fantastic painting. I've never seen it personally. I've only read some articles about it. I don't really have that much insight. But there are so many paintings that can be made within the time of an original. Just like the Mona Lisas that we saw, the many versions of the Mona Lisas. Almost none of those were made as forgeries. They were made as copies or inspirations or learning examples, all sorts of things, reasons why those were made. And they can be fantastic paintings in their own right. And I'm sorry, I just lost track of the question. I'm not certain I just answered it. So.
This is another great one that just came in from Kiki. What are qualifications schooling of an art restorer conservationist?
Okay. In modern terms, you go to school essentially. The graduate schools, there are a number of different graduate schools in the country. They take a very limited number of people every year. You have to be very strong in science, particularly organic chemistry. You have to have some skills, artistic skills, studio skills, that sort of thing, and a whole number of other language requirements and things like that to get into graduate school. It's a difficult road to go, to tell you the truth, because you have to be very, very committed to it. And it takes several years to, even beyond the basic undergraduate requirements, it takes several years of volunteer work and other things like that to build up the resume to be able to apply to graduate school. In the past, before the graduate schools became the norm, it was very much an apprenticeship kind of quality to it. And even there, like most skilled apprentices, once again, you have to have a wide variety of knowledge and probably 10, 15 years of, apprenticeship before you really be able to go solo in the profession.
I think we'll do maybe two more questions. We can do one of our docents, Diane Beckman, is asking, do we have any information about the restoration of the Authenticate, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, for touring purposes?
No, I don't know any specifics about it. I just know that has been handed down to me, so to speak, about that object. As Diane probably knows, it's interesting that object was found by our previous curator. She went to have a backyard tea with one of the donors to the museum, and the donor had been using it for plants, had used it as a planter in their backyard, and they had no idea how old it was or that it was authentic to the Roman Empire. But once we acquired it, of course, we display it as beautiful object it is. But I really don't know any more exact history about when it was restored or how it was restored. If you think about the context of the Bacchus figure, it just stands to reason that most likely that the bone box was probably discovered in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, something like that. And it was restored under the beliefs at that time. Like I said, people who were purchasing these artworks, who really valued them, they wanted them to be more complete in some respect. And it's kind of interesting that the context of that box is that the heads are recarved only on one side. So the other three sides remain in the condition that they were, which is relatively degraded. And I think that's kind of interesting that they left it that way, probably because only one side of it showed in the display where they were going to put it. But at the same time, it gives us that insight to understand what happened to the object.
Hey, and we'll do one more question. This one from Beth. Did the pandemic shutdown result in changes to explore special projects in your department? I also think that's a really great question.
Absolutely. The pandemic affected everything, just like everybody in the audience here. It made changes of its own accord, but also it just magnified every problem that we have in our life and in our work. Almost all of us, well, at one point, all of us were sent home except for a bare bones faculty here, staff here. And we had to work virtually. And as a conservator, a lot of our work is hands-on. All of that had to be put off. In many cases, we had objects all around the world from our collection because they were out for loans, things like that. The exhibitions that they were loaned to, their schedules changed dramatically. Some of the exhibitions were canceled, some were put off. Some of the objects go out and they go to multiple venues, and the venues would change. We had the same problems here. The many exhibitions that we had scheduled also got truncated. Some of them didn't happen at all. Some of them happened at different times. They became very complicated. So yes, it absolutely put a kink in everything we do here. I had 4 or 5 paintings that I was in mid-treatment on. And because of the various things that transpired over the year and a half now of COVID, all of those paintings are on hold and I'm doing totally different projects. So, and those old projects will be on hold probably for another year and a half or 2 years as we catch up to all the changes that happened because of COVID.
And I know I said that was going to be our last question, but we just got a great one that I think is also such a great question from Kiki. Again, it is, are there any modern artists or of this century that are more likely to be forged?
Oh, absolutely. Salvador Dali and Picasso probably have to be the front runners there. When you have an artist that lived as long as they both did and were so prolific, they have a vast amount of material out there. It's easy to believe that lots of things have flown under the radar and been lost, original pieces. And that's just, once again, muddy water that a forger can take advantage of by creating things that just fit the bill, fit the description, that sort of thing. And because they're 20th century, it's much easier to get closer to correct materials and things like that. You can go through all sorts of things. 20th century, there's all sorts of international artists and things that are being reproduced all the time because in a lot of ways, coming from other countries, the surveillance, the security, the understanding that these things are going on is not quite as clear. And so, especially with tourism, there's all sorts of things that are being reproduced and forged for the tourist market. We have that problem all the time with things from every era, not just the 20th century. So, so yes, forgery is alive and well, I can tell you that. Oh, and one last thing, Wolfgang Beltracci, he was convicted, and I forgot to mention, he and his wife were a team. His wife would make up the stories that help to promote these artworks, the forgeries that he was selling. And they both did very well, as you can imagine, selling things for millions of dollars at auction houses. But once they were both convicted, they spent a few years in jail. They've been out now for a while, and they are doing extraordinarily well because of the fame that they got in forgeries, making forgeries. And so not only is Wolfgang Beltracci's original art doing well, but he's continuing to make forgeries that are very well documented, and he sells them for a lot of money too.
Okay, we keep getting these great questions, so we understand, we want to be conscious of everybody's time. So if you have to hop off, thank you for joining us. But we did just get this question, which, I think is interesting. What steps, this is from Liz T, what steps were taken for preservation of the collection during the shutdown?
During the shutdown, well, probably the main thing we did, and like I say, our department is about preservation, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we do anything hands-on to specific artworks. So some of the main things that we did was simply make sure that someone was going through the building, making sure that everything was tight. We create the museum buildings themselves to be a perfect environment to preserve artwork, controlling temperature and humidity and light and that sort of thing. So we had to be sure that we weren't springing a leak, or the roof might have leaked, or sometimes the drainage gets stopped up and backs up water, things like that, making sure that the heat comes on and the air conditioning is at the right temperature, all that sort of thing. So we had people on a weekly, almost a daily basis, walking through the building, just making sure everything was in order. That's probably the main thing. Another thing I'd bring up is that we have a significant collection in our park. Some of you may know that our park never closed during COVID. It was actually a point of pride for the governor of North Carolina that our park, the museum, did not close, while many other state and national parks and whatnot did to the public. So not only were we not closed, we had record numbers of visitors, probably twice as many, 3 times as many visitors as we would ordinarily have. And so we frequently the staff would go through the park to make sure that these sculptures and artworks in the park were in good order and that they had not had adverse reactions with some of our visitors. So we had definitely had quite a bit of work to oversee the collection, just to make sure it was preserved during the shutdown.
Okay, well, I think this concludes the lecture. Thank you for those of you that stayed past 1 o'clock. We deeply appreciate you joining us this afternoon. And of course, I'd also like to thank Perry Thank you so much for joining us today and for providing this fascinating lecture and your wonderful insight and knowledge. And thank you, and we hope to see some of you at our upcoming events and exhibitions. Bye, everyone.